All right, hi everyone. Welcome back to Mao Reading Club. It's 9:05 already. I think we can start now. Our guest speaker, are you ready? Can we start now?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So I will start as usual. If you guys are have joined any of our reading club session for the past since last week and above, you guys have known this flow. So basically, I will just introduce first, start with the introduction first, and then we will start with the topic for today. Welcome to Mao Reading Club. Mao, short for Monsters Among Us, is a group of youth that empowers children and survivors of child sexual abuse through a myriad of programs like advocacy, education, and community involvement in hope to pave a safer way for childhoods. In line with the 2020 Sustainable Development Goals of quality education and gender equality, Mau Reading Club is an avenue for all youth in and out of Malaysia to discuss and ponder upon important issues relating to us. Treat this session as your safe space because we practice no judgments and prejudice towards anyone out there. For the purpose of ensuring our reading session to run smoothly while safeguarding everyone's comfort, Ma would truly appreciate it if we can adhere to the house rules below. So the first one is respect. When you are not talking, please mute the microphone by turning it off so that the session will not be interrupted by weird noises. Mao wishes for everyone to please be respectful of others, especially in discussing a certain topic or subject. Please be mindful of others when they are speaking by interjecting politely. We would appreciate it if everyone can join the session by using their names or nicknames so that we can properly address each other. Second, participate and engage. We welcome everyone who wishes to speak up during the session either by asking questions or sharing their inputs. We do not tolerate discrimination and harassment on one's sexual orientation, belief, and preferences. We reserve the rights to remove you from the session. We welcome differences in ideas, opinions, and views because we understand that each and every one of us has different foundations that shape us on how we see things. We also understand if you are not comfortable to speak by using the microphone, do type it out in the chat box. Everyone deserves to be heard, and this is a fun session. No one has to use huge jargons if you do not want to. Third, consent and privacy. This session will be recorded. If any of you feel uncomfortable about it, please inform us. Our YouTube channel will be in the meeting description. Please ask first before you want to record anything from the session for whatever purposes. Some may be a camera shy, which is totally fine and understandable. Please do not quote anything from the session without getting permission from the sayer. And it is okay if you wish not to show your face by turning the video off because it is your face, so you get to choose what you want to do with it. Last but not least, please enjoy the session to your heart's content. We hope everyone will get something from this session. So for this week, our topic is constructing the liberal Muslim, others, ethnic politics, competition, and polarization in Malaysia. So our guest speaker for this week is Salina Salim. She is a she is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Liverpool. Her research interests are on the political sociology of Muslim societies in Southeast Asia, with a focus on religious and gender politics. Salina holds a Master's Science in Political Science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She also holds a Master in Business and Economics Journalism and a Bachelor in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology from Boston University. She has held research positions at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, Sen Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, and at the Center for Asia and Globalization, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Her work has appeared in referred journals such as Religion, State and Society, Sociology of Islam, and Asia Minor. So, without wasting any time, I invite our guest speaker, Miss Salina, to take on the session.
Okay, thank you so much, Monsters Amongst Us team, for inviting me. I'm glad to be here to talk about my paper. Um, we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so this paper that I'm going to be talking about is basically part of a special issue on sectarianization in Southeast Asia. So I focus on Malaysia, and the other papers in this special issue focus on other countries such as Indonesia, and we also have one on Turkey. So the focus is on sectarianization thesis. So sectarianization thesis basically is a theory developed by two political scientists based in the US, and they use that theory to explain contemporary forms of Sunni Shiite sectarianism in Middle Eastern authoritarian contexts. So what we are doing with this special issue is something different. We are applying it in a Southeast Asian context, which is vastly different from the Middle Eastern context, and trying to use it to understand intra Muslim divisions, rivalries, conflict that has very little to do with Sunni Shiite sectarianism. So in this paper, I'm focused on providing an explanation for the salience of the liberal Muslim as a pejorative category in Malaysian politics. So I think our audience are mostly Malaysians, so you know that this term is used frequently in politics, right? Mahathir, for example, describes Anwar Ibrahim as a liberal, right? Um, so what does that mean? So I use this sectarianization thesis to analyze what factors are driving Malay political elites to construct and instrumentalize the Muslim liberal as an other for political gains. So what I mean by this is, right, there is no such pre-existing liberal Muslim identity category that is readily available. It's something that was constructed over a period of time. So this is very different from how the two political scientists use sectarianization thesis. They were focused on understanding sectarianization, right? The divisions between Sunnis and Shiites. Basically, these identities have centuries long history of theological differences, right? Um, Whereas the whole idea about the liberal Muslim is fairly recent. So this is the framework that I'm using, and the analysis. Okay, so my empirical material basically starts with the Reformasi movement in 1998. So I analyze it in three significant time periods between 1998 and 2020. The main argument I put forth is that the Malay political elites from UMNO, which obviously they led the government from the country's independence all the way until 2018, and they were primarily motivated by political competition to otherize their reform oriented Malay rivals as anti Islam liberal threats. And they did this to delegitimize them for political gains. Okay, next slide. Okay, I don't need to say too much about Malaysia. I'm sure everyone knows the context. So, what I would mention though about the political order is that there are two important elements. First one is the notion of Ketuanan Melayu, right? Malay dominance. The idea that Malays, as indigenous to the land of Malaysia, should be the primary ethnic group holding political power in accordance with its constitutionally mandated special position. The second element would be the pro Malay affirmative action policies that were put into place to uplift the economic position of the Malay community after the racial riots between the Malays and Chinese in 1969. Now, the targets for those affirmative action policies were believed to have been reached sometime in the 1990s. But as we all know, those policies have remained in place. And they have caused dissatisfaction amongst the ethnic minorities, but not only amongst the ethnic minorities, even amongst the Malay communities, some of whom perceive that uh, only the Malay elites are benefiting from the pro Malay policies. Now, that notion was exacerbated in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis. So, this is where my paper starts with the analysis. That moment of Anwar Ibrahim, who was the then deputy prime minister, um, being fired by Mahathir, right? That sparked off this whole movement, the pro democracy movement. Now, why is this important? Because I argue in the paper that this moment represents a fundamental change in Malaysian politics. Because this is when we start to see intersecting interests between the Malays and the ethnic minority political demands. They start to develop, they intersect, and they become more relevant in the subsequent time periods. So, reformasi resulted in the grouping of pro reform Malays and ethnic minorities under an opposition coalition. So the two primary political groupings were one, the pro Ketuanan Melayu UMNO group, which I refer to as elites, and the reform oriented opposition group, which in the paper I refer to as rivals. Now, a caveat here is that these terms are only for the purpose of understanding and denoting the primary form of polarizing political competition. So this doesn't mean that there are no elites in the opposition group. Obviously, Mahathir is an elite, right? So is Anwar Ibrahim. So is so many other opposition leaders. And then there are also religious elites who are important factor. But for the purpose of the paper, to denote polarizing political competitions, the UMNO group, I'm calling them the elites, and the opposition group, I'm calling them the rivals. Okay. Um, so while the elites sought to reaffirm established narratives of Ketuanan Melayu to maintain the hold on power, the rivals promoted pro-democratic values such as equality to act as approximate forceful projectiles that would change the political order, right? So you have these two opposing groups here. Um, Next slide. Okay, so what does this mean, right? The liberal Muslim. So, in the current Malaysian context, I would say that the mainstream understanding of the term liberal Muslim, it has a pejorative connotation of irreligious, freedom-seeking individuals being in opposition with Islamic tradition, values, and norms. While the term religious Muslim has a positive connotation of pious Muslims upholding the tenets of Islam. So, this form of understanding has rendered some Muslim reformist groups and individuals as inauthentic liberal other, right? So, who have been rendered as liberal? Now, this includes Muslim feminists, it includes Muslim reformists, it can also include the secular Malay civil society activists. Perhaps even some of you in your group have been labeled as liberal for some of the work that you do. Now, what's the commonality between all of these groups and individuals? I think one of the key threats is that they are espousing pro democratic values such as racial equality, inclusiveness, and religious pluralism. And as I mentioned earlier, also opposition politicians such as Anwar Ibrahim have been labeled as a liberal, right? So, what would account for this? One possible explanation could be um, the influence of religious teachings, right? Yet, I think this is inadequate because it doesn't explain why politicians such as Anwar Ibrahim, I'm sure some of you would already know he has credible Islamic roots, right? He's coming with a former ABIM Islamic civil society leader. He still retains a large following from those civil society groups, yet he can be easily delegitimized as a liberal by the elites. In 2019, for example, in a poll, only 13% of Malays said they support Anwar Ibrahim as a prime minister, right? Even though they knew that he was next in line. Okay. Um, Another element would be this: the Islamist-oriented civil society groups were not labeled as liberal. even though they engage with secular civil society groups and members of the opposition coalition on a number of issues, such as good governance, and they can be selectively critical of the pro-Ketuanan Melayu government and yet not be labeled as liberal, right? So it's contradictory. Um, Also, PAS, who is a Islamist political party, and they were part of the opposition coalition. They were also never in danger of being labeled as liberal. Okay, so one thing to note here, within the Islamist groups, obviously there are variable positions. In the UMNO elites, amongst them as well, there are variable positions. So there is this heterogeneity, both within and between the different Muslim groups. Okay, so given that, there would be varying degrees of disagreements on what would qualify as a religious Muslim. Right? There is no real consensus of what would qualify as the religious Muslim. So this underscores a important feature in Malaysia. The construction of what it is, what constitutes as the liberal Muslim as a pejorative category in politics, doesn't require an opposing and internally coherent religious or conservative Muslim category to be salient. Right? It functions powerfully as a divisive tool when used by the elites to signal threat under changing contexts of political competition and periods of crisis. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about sectarianization. Okay, what does that mean? Basically, Nadir Hashimir and Danny Postel, these are the two political scientists who came up with this. They define it as an active process shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts and pursuing political goals that would involve the mobilization of popular sentiments around particular identity markers. So, oftentimes in Muslim societies, this happens to be religious identity markers. Okay? So, sectarianization has been used to understand and explicate the factors in Sunni Shiite sectarianism. So, in the Malaysian context, I use it in a different way, and I'm using it to understand the elite's construction of a new identity category that didn't exist in a Malaysian context, right? So, if you look like 50 years ago, no one's talking about liberal Muslim in the Malaysian context, right? So there is no pre-existing liberal Muslim category that was available for the elites to manipulate, right? It was constructed based coming out of specific moments in Malaysian political history. So why then do I want to use this thesis? Okay, number one, there is the focus on the political context and the role of the elites. And this avoids the problematic essentialist assumptions about religion in politics. So oftentimes one of the problem is when scholars are studying Muslim societies, they tend to uh, always focus on the religion itself, right? That politics are occurring a certain way or moving in a certain kind of trajectory because of, say, interpretations, religious interpretations. That is just one facet of the problem, right? You've got to look at the context, you've got to look at the politics. So the other important element is that it's locating the role of the elite actors, the power relations, because they are in positions of power. They can be state actors. Okay, they could even be religious elites holding, amount of influence, and the changing context, such as political competition. Okay, so rather than conceive the liberal Muslim difference as a consequence of irreconcilable secular and religious worldviews, right, that is clashing, the secular and religious clashes, the analytical focus is basically on who are in the positions of power to determine what kinds of identities become relevant and when and why. Okay. All right, the caveats, I think I mentioned this. So in Malaysian context, you can't say that there was a pre-existing liberal Muslim identity in Malaysia. Such as, say, you're studying the Middle East, you can refer to the Sunni category or the Shiite category, and these have centuries of tradition, but you can't say that about Malaysia in terms of the liberal Muslim identity. And the second caveat would be there's of course the constructed identities are context dependent, right? For example, if you are in a different country context and you use the term liberal, um, it's not going to be perceived as anti-Islam the way it would be in Malaysia. Okay, next slide. Okay. All right. So basically, the approach that I use is to analyze the historical trajectories of change and causation. And I use primarily secondary source materials. This means newspaper articles, press release, the journal articles. Okay. So I analyze over 3 time periods, and each of these represent a stage in the sectarianizing process. So stage one, as I mentioned earlier, it begins with reformasi. Okay? The pro-democracy reformasi movement contributed to the development of competing ideas, that is, Ketuanan Melayu ethno-religious narrative versus the idea of equal rights. Okay? So reformasi presented a compelling counter discourse that directly challenged the dominant Ketuanan Melayu ethno-religious narrative that had been cultivated by the elites. So Malays who came to recognize the limitations in the socio-political order forwarded an equal rights centered counter discourse that challenged UMNO's careful cultivation of the Ketuanan Melayu narrative. So, elites, on the other hand, they depicted the reform oriented Malays, such as Anwar Ibrahim at that time, as Western liberal stooges. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next period of time that is significant would be the public contention with court disputes over religious freedoms. Okay, this happened throughout much of the 2000s, and it served to bring to the surface the growing ethnic minority dissatisfaction with the Ketuanan Melayu status quo. So these court disputes basically they emerge from the religious bureaucratic management of Muslim affairs that affected the ethnic minorities and a-religious Malays' religious freedoms. Right? So there is this clash between the legal system of secular civil law and then the Islamic law courts. So for ethnic minorities and reform-oriented Malays, Reformasi's ideal of democratic reform with the emphasis on justice and protection of rights and liberties kept being rejuvenated with each court dispute. So this time, the central idea forwarded by the reform groups was that the erosion of secularity in the Malaysian polity was the root cause for the individual rights infringements by the religious bureaucracies of the state. Now, on the other hand, Reformasi's Malay partners. So when Reformasi happened, remember there was the opposition political parties. There was also the Muslim civil society groups. There was Islamist political parties. All of them came together, right, at that time. Now, during this period of time in the 2000s, the Malay partners, right, this time they coalesced to defend the autonomy of the Sharia courts from outside interference. So the central idea forwarded by these groups was that Malay Muslims had to rise and defend themselves from the secular liberal onslaught, or else they will lose their ability to manage their own religious affairs. So at the civil society level, the reform-oriented activists emphasized individual rights and civil liberties to push for equal protections through the logics of secular liberal democracy, while the pro-Sharia activists emphasized culturally specific community rights through the logics of a Malay Muslim-dominated state. So, in this context of heightened inter-ethnic tension, the elites identified the reform-oriented ethnic minorities as liberal troublemakers who threatened to undermine Islam's position in Malaysia. Now, the Islamist groups, um, now in this context, they serve to spearhead fears over the liberal threat. So they were not sectarianized as liberal by the elites, even when these groups can and could be critical of the UMNO-led government. Okay? Indeed, these groups actually made it easier for UMNO elites to leverage the context to associate and delegitimize the political rivals based on the perceived threat posed by the rivals' supposedly liberal pro-democratic values. So this stage here, this period of time in the 2000s, was crucial in connecting polarizing societal conceptions of rights to competitive party politics. All right, next slide. Okay, so the meanings of the liberal other was already being shaped by those previous two stages. So this stage is all about consolidating, and this happens in the context of UMNO's electoral challenges. So while the elites appeased the pro-Sharia rights activists, they also alienated the ethnic minorities, who gradually shifted their votes to the opposition coalition. For example, in the 2008 general elections, the AMNO-led ruling coalition lost two-thirds majority in parliament for the first time. And then in the subsequent general elections in 2013, they retained power, but they lost the popular vote. Now, as the dominant party, right, UMNO is the dominant party in the ruling coalition, who claim to represent Malays and at the same time manage the ethnic minority needs, this represented a legitimacy crisis. Right? So after 2013, there was a noticeable spike in explicit references to liberal Malays by UMNO politicians, as well as the state religious bureaucracies. Yeah, and they came out with fatwas and sermons. Now, when UMNO, so in the paper, basically, I reference these, the explicit references, and I provide a bit more detail. Um, but what is suffice to say here is that when they lost their power in 2018, it was due mainly, of course, as we know, it was due to cost of living concerns of the electorate. It was the 1MDB scandal involving the UMNO elites. Wasn't so much about what I'm talking about here. Yet, UMNO still had a formidable arsenal in the form of an established and readily deployable understanding of the reform oriented rivals as the liberal other. So they used it to their advantage. Throughout 2019, when there were ethno religious controversies, they bring up this term and successfully delegitimize the reform oriented government. And by 2020, UMNO returned to the seat of power as part of this new political alliance. Okay. Um, Next slide. Okay. All right. So, in conclusion, so what does my paper contribute? So I'm working with the sectarianization thesis. So at the theoretical level, I'm contributing to a more nuanced understanding of this sectarianization process, divisions between Muslims in non-Middle Eastern contexts. So one important element I'm highlighting is that despite the absence of a pre-existing liberal Muslim identity that is readily available for manipulation, the difference can be constructed when there are other significant divisions. So in Malaysia's example, there is a pre-existing racially divided political system that the elites can leverage. Um, and second important element would be that this sectarianization occurs over time, right? Rather than in a single stage. It occurs over cumulative stages under facilitating conditions of political competition and socio-political crisis. So in the Malaysian case, some of the conditions and factors highlighted would be a society divided by inter-ethnic tensions, the legitimacy deficit suffered by UMNO elites, as the ethnic minorities and a segment of the Malays shifted their political allegiance to the reform-oriented rival coalition, and the elites' political imperatives for regime survival. At the empirical level, my paper also provides an explanation for the salience of the liberal Muslim as a pejorative category in Malaysian politics by locating the foundational sectarianizing links in the previous periods of socio-political crisis in recent history. Okay, so I think I'll end here and we can move to the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Miss Salina, for the discussion on your research paper. That's very brief. Obviously, you just had to take like 1 to 2 lines of each of the chapters that you're doing. Uh, but I think that's very packed, and well, it's a good overview of what you're studying. If you guys have any question, or maybe some of you guys wanted to review this slide, any of the slide that I've presented just now, do inform me in the chat box. I can just share the screen back, and we can open the slide again. Okay. But while waiting for them to ask any question, first question that popped up in my mind just now. I just wanted to know what inspired you to come up with this topic in the first place.
Okay, well, I mean, like I mentioned, I obviously follow Malaysian politics, and I
Mm-mm.
do see this term liberal Muslim being used quite frequently. So you will notice in the lead up to the 2018 GE, Najib was using those kinds of terms. He used it against the opposition um, coalition. He highlighted DAP, but he also used it against Malays as well, right?
Mm.
At the same time, there was also references to um, you know liberal deviant groups coming from the religious bureaucracies. So, for example, Sisters in Islam was deemed as a deviant liberal group, right? So all of that, sparked me to think, okay, why is that happening? Because if you look in a different country context, the term liberal is not pejorative, right? It would be, I mean, you would take it to mean you were looking for equality, you're
Yep.
looking for being more inclusive. So
Mm.
how come in Malaysia there is this different understanding? So
Mm-hmm.
that was the starting point. I wanted to understand why.
I see. So basically, it all started because basically you've been following the politics here in Malaysia, and then you saw this term liberal Muslim, and then it sparked into you that you just want to study about it. I think that's very interesting because we heard, I mean, as for me personally, I heard that term, but of course, well, like you said, in our society, when the term comes to like liberal, the word liberal, it it means as if it's a big thing. It's a bad thing, actually. While in other countries, like you mentioned, it just only means freedom of choice or freedom of understanding or anything, basically. So how come in Malaysia liberal means something that is so wrong, to a point that even it became an issue in the political side? So that's very interesting. Also, I would love to know what would be the objectives of your research paper.
Objectives in what sense? I mean, obviously, the main question I'm seeking to answer in this paper
Mm,
is to basically provide the history, right? I'm looking at the history behind how this term was constructed.
mm,
Um, so that is the objective that this paper is focused to. But this paper is part of my PhD
mm,
thesis. So it's explaining the context of Malaysia uh, that activist groups have to sort of navigate, right? So say even monsters amongst us. Say if you have some certain kinds of initiatives that you're working on, I think you would have to be careful not to be termed as liberal, because it will
yes.
complicate the things that you want to achieve. Uh,
Yes.
so that's basically what I'm doing. So this is one element of the larger research that I'm working on,
I see.
understanding the context, and then okay, once I got the context, now I'm seeing how the activist groups, because the other element is I'm looking at Muslim female activists and how they navigate this kind of this context, basically this polarizing context.
Mm. Okay. So there is a question here from Frizana. Hi, Sarina. Does the word liberal have the same negative connotation in Singapore?
Yeah, I think within the Muslim community in Singapore, I would say yes, it does.
Mm.
Interestingly, because the Muslim community here, uh, is very attuned to what's happening in Malaysia,
Mm.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do see that similarity. It is there, but I would say that here in Singapore, you have, because it's a secular. I mean, it's secular. The governance is secular,
Mhm.
so you don't have the dimension such as in Malaysia where you have Islamic law, right? That is governing quite a bit of how Muslims over there would live their lives. Over here,
Yeah.
it's different, right? Um, so given that you do have groups of groups that are calling themselves as liberal, right? They're taking ownership of that label. So
It's
yes, while there is the negative connotation in Singapore, you also have segments within the community who are taking ownership of that label, not label, but the term, to push forward, certain kinds of causes. For example, in Singapore, there was one group that is trying to educate on FGM, yeah, female genital mutilation.
okay.
Yeah,
So they are considered as the liberal.
they would be considered liberal because,
Mm,
yeah,
mm, mm, mm,
because MUIS that has not, they're pushing for MUIS, which is the Islamic organization in Singapore, to come up with a very strong statement to say it is not required in Islam, right? But
mm.
MUIS hasn't done so, and you have this small activist group who is pushing for it. And yes, some would label them as a liberal Muslim group.
It's well I think we have to admit, as much as we, of course, it's two different countries, Malaysia and Singapore. If the participants do not know, Miss Salina here is based in Singapore. So we are two different countries, but I gotta say, and I think most of us would admit that the Muslim community in Singapore would have very much similarities with the Muslim here. So I
Mhm.
think the two groups that you listed as something that is called liberal Muslim, which is the Muslim feminists, and also another one, Muslim reformists.
Mhm.
It would be called as liberal both in both countries. Yeah.
Yes, true.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to come and think of it, the word secular too, such a taboo word back in uni.
Yeah.
I well, I think I have not yet encountered with the word secular as something that is taboo. But what do you think, Miss Selena? Do you think it's the same case?
I think so. During the 2000s, for example,
Mm-hmm.
when we were having all of these court cases that was, affecting the ethnic minorities. Um, so things like the child custody battles, right, that were being played out in the courts. So a lot of people would say, well, this is an indication that the secularity of the Malaysian polity is being eroded.
Mm, I
So
see.
you would have people pushing forward to say, well, Malaysia should be moving towards, I mean, should be more secular, rather than, what it is today.
Mm-mm.
So activists such as Siti Kasim, I think you all know Siti Kasim, right?
Yeah, yeah.
She would take on that label liberal. She would call herself liberal, and she would say explicitly that Malaysia should be secular, right?
Mm,
That religion should be confined to the private sphere.
I see. Okay, another one from Lavinton. This is very long, but it's okay. So, hi, I have a question. Sometimes the phrase liberal Malay is also used by progressive Malays to distance themselves from more conservative Malay people who tend to come from underprivileged backgrounds, essentially a form of classism. How does everyone, including you, feel about it?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this one I have not really researched, but that's an interesting development. But I suppose that could be happening in the urban areas, yes, where they would take on that term, to sort of distance themselves from the wider society. But they would be a minority, I would say, right? I think there would be a minority of people who would come out and say that. Um, I think there are far more, even in the urban areas, there are far more uh, Muslims or Malays who would want to project more piety, right?
Mm,
I don't know. You tell me. 'Cause you live there. I'm a researcher. I study I study Malaysia, but all of you live there. So, what are your thoughts on this? Actually, why don't Laventon kind of comment on that? It would be interesting to hear.
if anyone wanted to give your opinion about what Leventon just said in the chat box, do just either turn on your mic or you can just type it out in the chat box. I personally do understand and have heard a few times the word liberal Malay. And obviously, well, the word liberal Malay is not as bad as liberal Muslim, because well then Muslim would liberal Muslim would then going around the religion. However, liberal Malay, like Levanten said in the comment, it's
Mhm.
between it's classism. It's basically more of, yeah, privileged group of people, and just said this underprivileged is liberal Malay, so that they can just feel they are better
Yeah.
and
But
stuff.
the important thing to note, what's unique about Malaysian context is that, of course, the constitution defines Malay as Muslim, so there's no getting around it, right? So even if you
Yes.
say liberal Malay, you are basically saying that that Malay is likely a Muslim, right? Uh,
Yes, true. I mean,
and
that is
recognized.
the what it state, what it's been stated, and like in that's been like planted in our minds. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's just like any other races as well. You know, religions is like anyone can have any religions and any races. Okay, so is there any other questions? Oh wait, I have one just now. Okay, this is like a very just a simple question. Um, I was just thinking, if it's not because of the pandemic, would you like either travel or like move for a while here just for your paper?
Oh yes, of course, definitely. If it
Mm,
wasn't for the pandemic, I'd be I'd be doing my interviews in Malaysia itself. But I'm limited now.
mhm.
I'm doing Zoom interviews for the rest of my
Ah,
research. Yeah.
okay. Good thing we have Zoom then, or not. You just have to do your research based on the internet,
Yeah.
articles and everything.
Mm.
So, is that all the questions that we have? Anyone else have any question for Miss Salina?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Leventon wanted to elaborate earlier. I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
Oh no, no, it's not really elaboration. I just thank you for answering. I'm sorry it was too long, but it kind of came from kind of looking from the outside looking in, because I'm Indian, and among Indian people, there's this really common thing, right? It's like a complex. It's like I'm not like other Indian people. I'm better. You
Mm,
kind of see that kind of classism where it's like, we talk about issues like gangsterism or crime. A lot of Indian people tend to distance themselves and say, "Oh, I'm not like them." So I kind of noticed that also in other communities. So I wonder if that's like a documented thing. Like, yeah, yeah. That's all I wanted to add. Yeah. Thank you so much.
okay. All right. Thank you for the clarification and also the question. So, if that is all, I think we can wrap it up. Miss Salina, do you have anything else to add, to say?
No, no, I don't have anything to add. But if anyone wants to reach out to me, you can email me.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, if you have, I'm sure all of you have the paper. But if you'd like access to the other papers in the special issue that I mentioned, just feel free to reach out to me.
All right. Okay. So, Farzana have, I think, the last one. I think it does manifest itself in the Malay community in Malaysia. Not so sure if it's been studied before. So,
Yeah.
I believe that one is it's referring to what Levantin said just now.
Mhm.
Fear, right? Yep. Okay. Yes. All right. So if that is all, I think we can wrap it up our session today. Thank you so much, Miss Saina, for joining us as a guest speaker and also for being interested to share with us about your studies. It is actually very insightful, and it's something pretty heavy, I have to say. But it's very educational. It just opens like one new thing for us to think of about our own country, basically. So that is all for this week. Don't forget, our reading session is every Friday, 9 to 10 p.m. And don't forget to follow our social medias as well for announcements. And that is all. Have a nice weekend, everyone, and have a good night. You may leave the meeting now.
Right. Good night, everybody.
Right, good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.